At least 6 West Africans who were deported from the United States to Ghana have been transferred to Togo despite mounting a legal challenge against their further deportation.
In a shocking turn of events, 11 West Africans were deported from the United States to Ghana, only for 6 of them to vanish into Togo, a country some had never even seen. No documents, no explanations, just gone. The world stayed silent. Ghana called it cooperation. The US labeled it immigration enforcement. But those familiar with this pattern in Africa see it for what it truly is: a modern rendition, outsourcing Western guilt to African soil. The question is stark. When did Africa become America's dumping ground? And what happens when a continent forgets to say no? A US military aircraft landed quietly in Accra, Ghana, not carrying soldiers or diplomats but deportees. 11 West Africans, shackled by paperwork and politics, were on board, treated as liabilities rather than lives. The US called it routine repatriation, but nothing about this was routine. These men, electricians, mechanics, small business owners, had lived in the US for years before being uprooted overnight. They weren't criminals, they were simply out of luck in a merciless system. The men were part of a secretive US-Ghana immigration agreement, buried in bureaucracy, allowing Washington to offload unwanted migrants to Ghana in exchange for diplomatic favor. No parliamentary debate, no press conference, just quiet signatures and a fueled aircraft. Upon arrival, Ghanaian immigration officers treated the men like cargo, detaining them without interpreters, lawyers, or clear charges. Then, in a stunning twist, 6 of the 11 were transferred to Togo within a week, 3 of whom had no connection to the country. No legal process, no confirmation of nationality, just gone. This transfer happened while their lawyers were still in court in Accra, arguing the detentions were unlawful. The Ghanaian High Court hadn't ruled, yet the men were moved before dawn, their names erased from the system by sunrise. This wasn't just procedural misconduct. It was a constitutional betrayal, signaling that Ghana's courts could be bypassed when Washington called. It sent a chilling message. Africa's borders are open not for its people, but for foreign orders. Ghana's government offered vague diplomatic responses, claiming cooperation with international partners on migration management. The US framed it as part of its African Repatriation Support Initiative, a bland term hiding a grim reality: a system allowing Washington to relocate deportees to countries willing to accept them, regardless of citizenship. Ghana was the experiment, Togo the consequence. Human rights lawyers in Accra called it rendition repackaged as diplomacy, accusing the government of violating domestic and international law. Opposition politicians demanded the agreement's disclosure, but the government refused, citing a classified bilateral understanding. In a democracy, the secrecy reeks of power, not partnership. This isn't just about 6 men. It's about a system where Africa's sovereignty is discounted, its dignity used as a geopolitical warehouse. The story begins not in airports, but in backrooms where a Memorandum of Understanding (MOU) between the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and Ghana's Ministry of the Interior was signed. Its language is deceptively benign: migration management, humanitarian cooperation, but a single clause reveals its truth. Ghana agreed to receive and facilitate the transit of persons of African descent, removed from the U.S., regardless of their nationality. This phrase reopens a colonial wound, treating Africa as a borderless holding pen for anyone with black skin. This deal stems from Trump's post-2018 immigration doctrine, where deportations became political theater. The U.S. needed partners in the global South to absorb migrants in exchange for aid or praise. Ghana, eager to maintain its status as a trusted democracy, signed on. Despite internal warnings that accepting non-Ghanaians could breach the 1951 Refugee Convention and Ghana's Immigration Act, the deal was reframed as strategic cooperation. The U.S. gained a clean way to deport without scrutiny, while Ghana became an extension of Homeland Security, sharing immigration databases and fingerprints across the Atlantic. Parliament only learned of the MOU after the first flight landed, by which time the damage was done. Why didn't anyone stop it? Where were the African Union, AU, ECOWAS, or Ghana's parliament? Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was deliberate. Africa's political architecture is wired to Western funding, from migration programs to border security. The AU's Migration and Displacement Division, for instance, relies heavily on EU and International Organization for Migration funding, aligned with US objectives. When the hand that pays violates your people, protest becomes a luxury. This silence has consequences, reinforcing the idea that Africans are disposable, that deportees can be dropped anywhere on the continent without accountability. This pattern isn't new. Europe has long outsourced its border policing to North Africa, with Libya and Tunisia accepting billions to detain migrants, turning detention centers into torture chambers. African governments called it migration partnership instead of a human rights catastrophe. Now the US has adopted this playbook in West Africa. Ghana's refusal to suspend the deal, fearing strained US relations, shows how diplomacy becomes a leash. Western media framed the deportations as orderly migration, while African officials echoed the same, turning a human rights violation into an administrative success. The silence also exposes Pan-African hypocrisy. The AU, preaching continental unity, was absent when Africans needed it most. ECOWAS, quick to sanction coups, couldn't muster a statement on extrajudicial deportations. This silence stems from fatigue. Many African leaders believe resisting Western injustice is futile, given the threat of frozen aid or sanctions. But silence sets precedents. The US-Ghana deal is the first of many, with similar agreements quietly negotiated across Africa. The logic is clear. America provides support, Africa provides silence. Yet silence isn't eternal. Beneath it, resentment grows. Africans see the hypocrisy, the puppet strings behind the smiles. In Accra, lawyers launched Africa Belongs to Its People, demanding transparency. In Lagos, activists petitioned ECOWAS for a tribunal on forced deportations. In Togo, journalists are probing who authorized the transfers. This defiance isn't just outrage, it's about reclaiming control. Africa's new generation, digitally armed and globally connected, refuses to inherit the politics of politeness. They see migration control as neo-colonial extraction, regulating human movement for Western profit. The US system is sophisticated, not forceful. After 2018, overflowing detention centers and lawsuits over migrant children in cages pushed Washington to externalize deportations. Africa, with weak migration oversight and financially dependent governments, was ideal. Military aircraft, once used for weapons, now transport migrants, rebranded as humanitarian missions. The system's power lies in its deniability. The US claims it only facilitates, Ghana claims good faith, Togo claims humanitarian grounds. The migrants, erased by paperwork, have no recourse. This isn't just deportation, it's leverage. The US ties migration compliance to trade, security, and visas. Non-compliant countries face slowed approvals or frozen aid. Compliant ones are praised. This colonial mechanism, now bureaucratic, is spreading. The EU already uses African territory as an external border. The US is mapping the Sahel and Gulf of Guinea for detention routes. But cracks are showing. Nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, breaking from Western orbits, prove sovereignty doesn't need permission. As Africa shifts toward independent policies, the West's control weakens. The Ghana scandal wasn't a footnote, it was a spark. Civil society is connecting the dots, seeing migration control as containment, a modern Berlin conference carving human mobility. Young Africans, rejecting Western propaganda, are telling their own story. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, they demand transparency and continental protocols against unverified deportations. Academics draft migration frameworks centered on African dignity, while media expose neo-colonial ties. The West won't relent easily. Aid may be cut, visas delayed. But Africa has leverage, resources, population, and partnerships with Asia and Latin America. The deportation scandal has become a mirror, forcing Africa to see its betrayed pride. This isn't just about 6 men. It's about a continent reclaiming its right to say no. When Africa draws that line, the world's balance of power shifts. The quiet era is over. The roar has begun, loud, clear, and unafraid. How long will Africa call exploitation cooperation? When will silence become betrayal? If the West keeps drawing the lines, will Africa ever be free?